This video lecture is for the Theology 2 course at the East Asia School of Theology, and this lecture is on views of the millennial kingdom. Part of our blessed hope as Christians is the promise of the millennial kingdom. But as is true of so many issues in eschatology, there is a tremendous amount of controversy and debate surrounding the millennium. When will it be? Has it already dawned? How will it come about? And what will it be like? During the course of history, the church has developed essentially three main views about the millennial reign of Christ, and it is to these three views that we will now turn. Now, in my previous video lecture on the historical overview of the last things, I covered the three different views of the millennial kingdom very briefly. But in this lecture, we will go into greater detail about each of these views of the millennium. So, what exactly are the different views of the millennium? Well, there are three, and some would say four basic views of the millennium. And these three or four views are, number one, amillennialism, number two, postmillennialism, and then number three, premillennialism. Now, the reasons why some say there are four basic views of the millennium is because those who are premillennialists have two major positions. There are the historic premillennialists and the dispensational premillennialists. And again, I will go into each of these views in greater detail. So let's take a look at these four basic views of the millennium. So the first basic view of the millennium is known as amillennialism. Now, amillennialism says that we are presently living in the millennial kingdom, which is characterized by simultaneous experiences of gospel victory and suffering for Christ. The millennial kingdom doesn't involve Christ's physical rule on earth, but rather it involves his present spiritual rule in heaven. Satan has already been bound since Christ's first coming, but Satan will be released shortly before Jesus' second coming, when he will bring great persecution upon Christians. We do need to note that amillennialists do expect a visible physical return of Jesus Christ. Okay? Now, so this chart gives you a basic overview of amillennialism. This chart gives you a basic overview of postmillennialism. So postmillennialism is the second basic view of the millennium that Christians have developed. And postmillennialism says that Christ will return after the millennium. There will be a long period of moral improvement on earth. Like amillennialists, premillennialists believe that the millennium is figurative, not literal. However, where amillennialists expect suffering for the faith to continue until Christ returns, postmillennialists have historically expected persecution to gradually decline as the gospel penetrates different societies and people groups in ever greater depth. Now, postmillennialism declined during the 20th century due to such horrors as the two world wars, the Holocaust, the development of nuclear weapons, and the brutal rule of various communist governments. Now, there are still those who believe in postmillennialism, although those who still hold to postmillennialism now concede that moral progress will not be steady or continuous. In other words, they now admit that there may be periods in history when moral progress will slow down or even decline, but they still remain confident that over the long term, now very long term, the gospel will advance and the world will get better and better. So that's the post-millennial view of the millennium. And then the third basic view of the millennium is premillennialism. And premillennialism says that Jesus will return before the millennium. And this chart gives you an overview of what premillennialists believe. Now, as I said earlier, there are two different branches of premillennialism. The first is historic premillennialism, which was held from the 1st century onwards. And then there is dispensational premillennialism. This view began to be promoted in the late 19th century and has become the dominant view among some segments of Christians. Now, okay, both historic and dispensationalist premillennialists expect Jesus to return after a period of great suffering known as the Great Tribulation. While there are a number of significant differences between historic and dispensationalist premillennialists, the key difference between these two views centers around when the rapture will take place. Now, the rapture is when Christians will be caught up with Christ in the clouds. And 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 and 17 speak of this, okay? So this is the rapture, when Christians will be caught up with Christ in the clouds. Now, historic premillennialists believe the rapture will occur at the end of the Great Tribulation, at the same time as Jesus' visible return, while dispensationalists believe that the rapture will occur before the Great Tribulation and that the church will not experience the horrors of the Great Tribulation, when God will pour out his wrath upon unbelievers. Now, just to come back to these four basic views, I want to mention that amillennialism is actually a fairly recent phenomenon. For most of church history, the postmillennial and amillennial positions were pretty much in the same camp. It is only in recent church history that these two positions have had a parting of the ways. So now what we're going to do is we are going to take a look at each of these positions in greater detail. And we're going to look at the argument for each position and the argument against each position. I will also include some responses to some of these objections for each position. So let's look at the argument for and against premillennialism. The first argument for premillennialism is that the most natural interpretation of Revelation 20 demands premillennialism. So in Revelation 20, it talks about what will happen after Jesus' return. It talks about the great the judgment. It talks of everyone before God. It talks about the first resurrection of the dead and the second resurrection of the dead. And it also talks about how after a period of 1,000 years, Satan will be released to make war against God one last time. Okay. Now, there are arguments against this position that the most natural interpretation of Revelation 20 is premillennialism. And we will get into those arguments against this case when we get to amillennialism. Okay. So the second argument for premillennialism is that a consistent hermeneutic leads to premillennialism. In other words, premillennialism gives us the most consistent interpretation of all the biblical passages concerning the end times. Now, so this argument for premillennialism says that other millennial views are inconsistent in how they interpret the Bible, because at times they interpret certain things about eschatology in a literal sense, and at other times they spiritualize other aspects of eschatology. Premillennialism, on the other hand, takes a more consistent literal, historical, grammatical interpretation of the Bible. In addition, throughout the Bible, we see consistent language that speaks of God's promise of an everlasting kingdom as being and also we see consistent language of a physical bodily resurrection, and as well as consistent biblical language of a new heaven and a new earth. All of this points to a future physical millennial kingdom. Now, there are arguments against this. And one of the arguments against premillennialism says that premillennialists themselves sometimes interpret things in a figurative manner. For example, in the book of Revelation, we have the 7 stars, which premillennialists interpret as representing 7 angels. We also find 7 lampstands in Revelation, which premillennialists interpret as referring to 7 churches. Furthermore, critics of premillennialism argue that a literal, historical, grammatical interpretation of the Bible doesn't fit the Semitic worldview of the scriptures. Now, premillennialists would respond to this objection by pointing out that figures of speech are not contrary to a literal interpretation of Revelation and other apocalyptic literature in the Bible. Okay. There is a third argument for premillennialism, and that is that the unfulfilled prophecies of the Old Testament demand a premillennial interpretation of the millennium. Now, the rebuttal to this argument is that these prophecies were fulfilled in Jesus' day. For example, critics would say that Israel's return to the land was fulfilled in Israel's return from Babylon and before Christ's first coming. That these critics would also argue that the visions of the prophets concerning the Messiah were actually fulfilled in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And they would also argue that biblical teachings about the temple, the priesthood, and the sacrificial system were also fulfilled in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Now, this rebuttal that I just shared with you is based on the amillennialist interpretation of the millennium. Now, premillennialists would respond to this rebuttal by saying that these prophecies should still be interpreted in a literal fashion. A fourth argument for premillennialism is that the early church fathers were premillennial. For example, Papias, Justin Martyr, and Irenaeus were all premillennialists. And I touched on these three men in during my lecture on the historical overview of the last thing. So if you want to review what I said about those men, you can go back to that lecture. Now, there is an argument against this contention that the early church fathers were premillennial. And that argument is that the church fathers were not uniformly premillennialists. For example, they would point out that Irenaeus appears to have had some Neoplatonic views when he suggested that more spiritual Christians will inhabit the new heaven, while the less spiritual Christians will inhabit the new earth. And then there is a fifth argument for premillennialism, and that is that the millennium will be a fitting climax to history. In other words, Christ's return will bring an end to all the evils and injustices in our present world and will bring perfect peace and perfect justice. All other events in human history will pale in comparison to Jesus' glorious return. And the objection to this argument is that Christ's first advent, not his second, is the real climax of history. So in some ways, how you understand this argument depends on what you view as the real climax of history. Was it Jesus' first coming, or will it be his second coming? So these are the arguments for and against premillennialism. Now, let's look at the arguments for and against amillennialism. Okay? The first argument for amillennialism is that there is no real purpose for the millennium. So amillennialists would say, why do you need a millennium? There's no real purpose for it. And so amillennialists wonder, once Christ has returned and the church age has ended, why is there any need for a 1,000-year delay of the start of the eternal state? And premillennialists would respond by saying that the reason for the millennium is for God to fulfill his promises to the Jews, to Jesus, to the church, to the nations, and to creation. For example, God promised the Israelites, he promised the Jews that he would send a Messiah to rescue them. He also promised to the Jews that David's heir will rule forever on the throne of David. And God also promised to the Jews, gave them a promise of land, that they would inhabit the land that God promised them. Now, premillennialists would argue that these promises to the Jews have not yet been fully fulfilled. And that is the purpose, that is the purpose of the millennium, is to complete the fulfillment of these promises to the Jews. Other promises include the promise that God the Father made to Jesus. And that promise was that Jesus will have dominion over all nations. And so the millennium is the time when Jesus will exercise his dominion over all nations. There is also the promise to the church, and that promise is that believers will reign with Jesus. And so the millennium is a time when believers will reign with Jesus. There's also the promise to the nation that there will be worldwide peace. And as we look at human history, we know that there has never, ever since the fall, there has never been a period where there has been worldwide peace. And so this promise has yet to be fulfilled. And so the millennium will be a time when this promise to the nations will be fulfilled. And then there is God's promise to creation, that the curse that was placed on creation at the fall will be lifted. And so the millennium will be the time when this promise to creation will be fulfilled. So that's the case for and against amillennialism in terms of the question of what is the purpose of the millennium. The second argument for the amillennial position is that is concerned with the nature of apocalyptic literature. Amillennialists point out that apocalyptic literature often makes use of symbolic and figurative language and should not be interpreted literally. For example, we find imagery of horses, dragons, beasts, etc. And so amillennialists would say we should not interpret these kinds of images literally. And so because of the nature of apocalyptic literature makes Revelation and other parts of the Bible that deal with the end times extremely difficult to interpret, amillennialists use this observation as an argument in favor of their position, that we should not look for a literal millennial kingdom, that because apocalyptic literature is largely figurative and symbolic, we should also expect the millennial kingdom to be figurative or symbolic. Now, the objection to this argument is that figures of speech are not contrary to a literal interpretation of Revelation and other apocalyptic literature in the Bible. We should not let the difficulty of apocalyptic literature keep us from studying, teaching, and preaching about the last things. So those are the arguments for and against amillennialism based on the nature of apocalyptic literature. A third argument for amillennialism is that an earthly kingdom is inconsistent with the spirit of Christ. And this is based on the assumption that the church and Israel are one. The New Testament, and so amillennialists say that the New Testament writers interpret Old Testament teachings and practices such as the temple, the priesthood, and the sacrificial system, and so forth, in light of Christ. Therefore, these teachings and practices should now be understood in a spiritual sense rather than in a physical sense. Furthermore, to interpret these things spiritually doesn't mean they're somehow non-existent. Instead, these spiritual realities are just as real as the physical realities of the Old Testament. In fact, amillennialists would argue that they are even more real than the physical realities of the Old Testament. So the objection to this argument for amillennialism says that the spiritual physical split is deeply rooted in the ancient Greek belief that the spiritual realm is good while the physical realm is bad. And so, and those who object to this argument point out that this physical spiritual split is not part of the biblical worldview, that in fact it goes very much against the biblical worldview, which views the physical world as good, even though it has been corrupted by the fall, because God is the one who created the physical universe. So that's the argument against this particular proof for amillennialism. Another argument in favor of amillennialism is that the New Testament does not teach a millennium apart from Revelation 20. In other words, amillennialists observe that the only time the Bible ever mentions the millennium is in Revelation 20. And therefore, they would argue that because that we should not base an entire interpretation of theology on a single passage in the Bible. Well, the objection to this argument is that it's only necessary for the Bible to state something once for it to be true. For example, the Tower of Babel is mentioned only once in Genesis 11. Yet both Jews and Christians believe this event actually happened. Now, a fifth argument in favor of amillennialism is the argument of simplicity versus complexity. And so amillennialists will point out that premillennialism requires an unnatural situation with many resurrections, judgments, and a mixture of glorified and unglorified people. For example, the premillennial view has two resurrections mentioned in Revelation 20, separate judgments for believers and unbelievers, and both glorified and unglorified people living together during the millennium. Now, the response to this argument is that throughout the Bible, we see a more complex, nuanced view of the millennial kingdom, in which it seems that death will still occur, although human lifespans will be much longer than they are currently, and in which it seems that sin will still take place. In addition, the Bible speaks of the nations learning the ways of the Lord during this time, which seems to imply that in some sense, not everyone will fully understand God's ways. So these are the arguments for and against amillennialism. Now let's look at the argument for and against postmillennialism. Now, let me go back to amillennialism very quickly. We need to acknowledge that there are valid biblical arguments in favor of amillennialism. We should not take the view that amillennialists are somehow not true Christians, or somehow that they have things wrong, or that they're somehow basing their view on liberal humanism. They have valid biblical arguments. And the same can be said for postmillennialism. Postmillennialists do have valid biblical arguments to back up their views. And so there will always be debate between these three views, because all three views have scripture to back up their argument. Okay, so let's look at the argument for and against postmillennialism. So the first argument for postmillennialism is concerned with the growing influence of the gospel. And this is based on the Bible's clear teaching that God wants everyone to be saved, as well as confidence that God is able to empower believers to accomplish the evangelistic task of reaching the entire world with the gospel. There are also numerous biblical passages that speak of a time when the gospel will fill the whole world. For example, in Matthew 13, 31 and 32, Jesus speaks of how the kingdom of heaven will begin as a small mustard seed and will eventually grow to become a large tree in which the birds of the air will be able to make their nests in. Likewise, the parable of the yeast, also just a few verses later in Matthew 13:33, also speaks of how the gospel will penetrate the entire society and by extension, the entire world. So as I said earlier, it is important to understand that there really is a good biblical case to be made for postmillennialism, in contrast to the claim that is often heard that postmillennialism is simply based upon liberal humanism and has no biblical basis. Now, the response to this argument for postmillennialism is to note the events during the past century or so. Because during the past century or so, we've had terrible, terrible events that have happened, including World War I, World War II, the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, the development of nuclear weapons, as well as the brutal rule of communist countries. And in addition, we've seen that sometimes in the so-called free world, there have also been despotic governments during the past century or so. And so all of these horrible events that have happened during the past century or so seem to discredit the idea that the world is getting better and better. Furthermore, how long must we wait for Christ's kingdom to be fully realized by the church? It's already been nearly 2,000 years since Christ's ascension, and in many ways, the world still seems just as messed up now as it did in Jesus' day. Now, let me just make a personal comment, okay? This is my personal comment. And that is that Christian influence has definitely led to the betterment of society in many ways, including bringing an end to slavery, promoting the spread of literacy, the establishment of countless hospitals and humanitarian organizations to alleviate human suffering, and even the development of new technologies that have greatly improved human life. Yet, despite all of these improvements, we still live in a world where human trafficking is taking place on a widespread scale, where ghastly wars are still being fought with ever more lethal technology, and where new forms of addiction are taking root. And I would just like to recall a quote from the very first paragraph of Charles Dickens' book, A Tale of Two Cities. He begins, the very first line of this book begins with the words, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." And this is true, this has been true of every generation in history. Every generation in history has been the best of times. And yet every generation in history has also been the worst of times. Okay, so that's my personal comment on this. Now, there is another argument in favor of postmillennialism, and that is the kingdom of God is a present reality. For example, the New Testament passages about God's redemptive work in humanity typically use the present tense, which points to God's ongoing work of saving people at the present time. Now, the response to that would be that God's ongoing work of redemption is indeed a reality, but there are still significant biblical prophecies and promises that have not yet been fulfilled. And I spoke about these earlier in this lecture in response to questions about the purposes of the millennium. So those are the arguments for and against postmillennialism. So in this lecture, we've covered different views about the millennium. And now we will look at different views of the tribulation and the rapture of the church. So please look for the next video lecture.